definitely more shell hash here. As we see them move along, you can actually see the shells moving along and rolling along the bottom. So that's where this is the highest energy.
Yeah, exactly.
I think there's more shell material here today because of the recent storm that came through. There's lots of shells offshore, but if the waves are a little bit bigger, they'll drag it up, bring it up into suspension, roll along, and bring it up into shore. So, but if you come in here in 3 weeks or so, all this will be gone. All these shells will be gone. Just what's available to it. I guess what's offshore, yeah, just some small micro variations, and that's enough. If you walk along the shore here, you're probably going to get a variation in how much shells you have, just because of how what it was dragging from offshore. All right, so now we're standing here at the very end of Galveston Island, and we have San Luis Pass right here. So this is one of those few natural tidal inlets going back and forth. And you can kind of, not quite as much, but you can see offshore there. Somebody out there in a kayak? Yeah, somebody out there in a kayak. Just past the kayak, you can see some waves, right? You can see some white caps. That's your ebb tide delta, right? Because what do tides do? They go in, and they go out. And again, so we have all the tides, the whole tide from the Gulf of Mexico is trying to come in, but now it's trying to come in through the San Luis Pass. So it's constricting, those flow lines are coming together. What happens when flow lines come together? Speeds up, you get more energy. Yeah. That's what's keeping San Luis Pass open. It gets more energy, it can carry bigger grains, and it can carry more of them. And so then it goes in, and it goes into West Bay behind us, but as it spreads out, it slows down and then drops out, and that's what causes the flood tide delta, which is on the other side. But then it's got to come back out again, comes back in, constricts, speeds up, then comes back out, slows down, and now it's trying to fill in the Gulf of Mexico with the delta, and that's the ebb tide delta. All right. He's got a. Let me switch to that. So on page 62, we have San Luis Pass, it's at the very end. We have the ebb tide delta out to there, the flood tide delta out through here. Why is there a big difference in size between the flood tide delta and the ebb tide delta? On page 62. There's a big difference in size. Why is there a big difference in aerial extent of these guys? Any ideas? You shut up.
Because the longshore drift distributes sand that would accumulate along here.
It does a little bit of that, but that's not the reason.
The Venturi?
What?
A Venturi, it's all being funneled into it?
Well,
funneled in more.
That's why you're not getting any deposits in the channel itself, is because the channel is being so much energy that it's carrying everything, including big shells.
You have less sediments? Less sediments?
One is less sediments, so you have a really big aerial extent to the flood tide delta, but a really small aerial extent of the ebb tide delta. So it is a volume consideration, right? Is there more volume of grains in a flood tide delta than in an ebb tide delta?
Sure, probably. Looks like.
You're forgetting the third dimension.
Energy.
No, the third dimension. Thickness. What's the depth of the lagoon behind us? Somebody was saying whether dry, whether it's
was 5-6 feet, but it's a little bit deeper.
Yeah, it's a little bit deeper, but it's tens of feet, right? How deep is it out here in the Gulf of Mexico? Much deeper. So there could be the same exact volume of sediments being expressed in both the flood tide and the ebb tide delta. It's just that the ebb tide delta is trying to fill in a much bigger hole, and so it just can't go as far. So any prograding system, right, it's still a delta. So it's prograding out into the Gulf of Mexico, it's got to fill in a deeper hole so it can't be as aerially extensive. The flood tide delta, it's got to go way, and all that energy's got to disperse across a shallower thing, and so it's got to go farther out to deposit. But and then it can cause all these little channels, which maintains its energy, and then you get a full delta thing going back and forth. So yeah, so there, your results in your particular area will vary, but just because there's smaller aerial extent doesn't mean there's less volume. Because you got to think that the ebb tide delta is always trying to fill up a bigger hole than the flood tide delta. But then your flood tide delta might be smaller, because I've seen a few flood tide deltas that are very small, because the back lagoon is actually trying to fill up an estuary with a flooded river valley, and it's just not that much space for it to be there, because simply isn't enough space for the flood tide to go. So it's all about your confining topography, right? Your topography is very influential. All right, here's a nice core that Shell took back behind the bridge over there, and you can see this is tons of shell hatch. All right, some really big oyster shells and broken up shells that are sitting right next to the tidal channel, because that is the highest energy environment that we have here on this part of the Gulf Coast, is this tide moving back and forth. It's not a very big tide, but because of the topographic constraints, it can move a lot of material, and it can move some of the course string material on a regular basis outside of big hurricanes and things like that. All right, what is longshore drift doing here? The longshore drift is going that way, so it's bringing along a lot of sand, right? What do we say longshore drift is trying to do as it goes along through here? It's trying to connect Galveston Island with Follett's Island, right? At the Brazos River, it was trying to connect across from both sides of the delta. The river was preventing it from doing so because it had the fluvial energy. Here, the tidal energy is not allowing it to happen. You still have longshore drift. You still have a lot of sand coming down through here, but now what that sand is doing is the tides are taking that sand and pushing it into the tidal channel. And so I'm going to bring the poster. My apologies. I don't think I have anything quite through here. Well, yeah, okay. So here on page 61, you can see the sand that we pass, and you can see back from the 1950s to today. It's almost a little simple, but you can see definitely in the 50s, before they built the bridge, kind of looks like a little fish head. But you can see these little spits of sand that are going into the tidal channel. That is longshore drift trying to make a sand spit to connect these two, but the tides are turning it and making these elongated little sand spits, and we still see them today. And so I took take a picture of them, and you can see back through here my friend walking along one of these little sand spits that are some partially submerged, partially not. And they kind of got a little undulatory, but it's not from waves, it's from the tides pushing all this material from longshore drift into the tidal channel. And then there hasn't been a storm or a big surge coming through here to kind of mess them up and rip them around. Because through time, if you go back and go on Google Earth, there was a time when all this was underwater, and then it's been slowly coming back through time. So this beach sometimes is here, sometimes it's way in the back, so there's lots of variation, and this beach is here. And that really depends upon longshore drift, how much sand supply is coming through here, versus how many hurricanes have come through here and ripped all this stuff apart. So we're seeing that interaction now here, not between fluvial and longshore drift and wave action, but between tides and wave action going on through here. Now we talked about how Follett's Island was one of these skinny guys, right? And we said it's skinny because why? Because it was sand starved. We got lots of sand here. Why is that island sand starved? Can't get across. Where is all this sand going? Into the ebb tide, into the flood tide deltas. So you got a lot of sand coming along Galveston Bay, right? Because it's coming down San Jacinto River, it's coming down the Trinity River, going to Galveston Bay, coming out through there. So Galveston Island has a lot of sand, but when it comes down through here, it hits this tidal inlet, and then the tidal inlet says, nope, you can't go any farther, I'm going to distribute there, in the flood tide delta, or I'm going to take it back to the ebb tide delta. So that's why you can have right next door to one another a barrier island that's a little skinny, small, narrow, and retreating, going that way, right next to an island, Galveston Island, which is actually mostly going out and prograding, because you have lots of sand for Galveston Island, but because the sand we pass, you're not having hardly any sand for Brazos Island.
When you have a hurricane,
Was the original shoreline 8,000 years ago. As it was pushing back, all these storms and all these activities happening, wash over deposits, and so it's moving the whole island back. If it rises up fast enough, then you can actually overwash the island and make it turn it into an offshore bar or into a shoal. And so Ship Shoal, Tiger Shoal, all those are probable old barrier islands. And so Galveston Island and these islands here are taking that's some of their sand supply as well, from offshore sand and big storms pushing the sand up here, as well as sand coming down the river system. So it's a combination of both.
Would Chocolate Bayou, which is right over there, have made a bit of a valley right here in order to
It's
allow it to go
possible.
this way?
I don't know the exact origin of San Luis Pass, but it developed as it developed. These islands were developed, and these guys, Galveston Islands started forming about 6,500 years ago. Brazos Island only started forming, they're saying, about 2,500 years ago. So because of that, there's these low points that the tide can exploit. So this has always been low, and so the tides can always exploit it, and longshore drift couldn't actually overcome it.
That's why I was wondering with Chocolate Bayou.
Yeah,
and the
it's
San
possible.
Jacinto.
Most likely, it was some sort of fluvial feature that was made of the low, and then the tide started exploiting it when sea level was rising up. So that's the most likely story. Yeah. So, but I don't know enough about it exactly to say which one it is. But I know it's been around here a long time. and it will probably stick around here a little bit longer too, because it's been established now.
Well, now, have you seen human-caused changes to the deltas out here, or does nature just overwhelm all the human-caused things?
We don't. Well, for the flood tide, ebb tide delta, that changes slightly, mostly due to sediment supply and how many hurricanes actually hit right here. You see more modification on Galveston Island, trying to preserve the beach and trying to preserve the dunes, because anything that's on the beach is public property, and if your beach goes underneath your house, you are actually legally required to remove your house. Nobody does, because they're waiting for the next hurricane to come through and get the insurance money. Or there's a lot of activity to try to build new dunes. There's things called geotubes and other things that are trying, and they put sprinkler systems on them, and then the boardwalks that go over the dunes instead of through the dunes. They're trying to do things to preserve the dunes, because that's the natural protection of that next line of houses. So it depends upon, along that next row of houses, how many people have the governor's ear to spend money on some sort of dune protection program.
Didn't they have some beach nourishment projects?
They're
with the
constantly
last
doing
decade?
beach nourishment protections, particularly on Galveston, on Galveston Beach in front of the seawall.
But would that
We'll
affect
stop there at
things
the very
down
end.
here?
What?
Would that affect things down here?
Eventually,
Adding
yeah.
more?
Longshore drift's going to come and take it away. So when we get down to at the last stop, we'll stop at the end of the seawall, and we could talk a little bit about the beach nourishment program. That's a whole, multi-million-dollar thing to do that as well. Well, it preserves this beach for a little while. So. Yeah. Go look at this picture here, where you can see there's a little preserve that we can drive by and actually see some of these ridges and swales. They're about 30 to 70 meters apart, and just a meter or less of height in between. So not too prominent, but they're signifying these sand ridges that form. Now, the sand ridges, how they form is, I got a couple of things starting on page 29. There's just a whole series of things of how these sand ridges can form. Really nice paper out there by Fitzgerald that explained all this sort of stuff. But basically what it does is there's so much sand that as the storms or whatever push apart, these ridges, some sort of nucleus through there, right? It could be all this, at the berm, all this seaweed material, logs and things, all this rack line could form a little nucleus for these ridges. And there's other things, scarping and some other things. But they kind of bulldoze and push sand up in a pile, and it pushes it up so high that eventually you can't overwash it. right? And then something else happens, then a little bit of action, a little less stuff, a little more quiescent time, and then more sand supply comes in and makes another bulldoze some more sand pushing up through there. You get a little sea level lowering or whatever, and you grab some more of that shoal sand out through there, or you have a bit more climatic conditions and a lot more sediment supply coming down the rivers, and you're just adding to that, and it pushes the sand, and so it forms all these ridges, and it forms enough ridges, and then they get a little higher, and then they get trees and vegetation and become more stabilized, and then overwash can't make it over. They get so wide and they get so tall that even the biggest storms can't make washover fans to push these things. When you look at Galveston Island today, you can actually see some remnant washed over. I don't think I have a good picture of it, sorry. Mitchell Ridge, there's Indian artifacts from the indigenous peoples that came out here and were sitting up there because it was a really great place to fish, right? So they come out here during the months the fish were running and do their little things, get their fish, and then go back into them, you know, during the months for that sort of thing. So yeah, so we can see that, so we can actually date the progradation of Galveston Island as it comes out.
Now what about that one in blue? That's gone.
Yeah, well, that's because we modified it and we've built the seawall and taken away the sand supply, and so now it's actually a little bit retreating, and we're trying to stop that. Very, mankind's effort is just dramatically unsuccessful.
So many ways.
But in so many ways, and we try to keep it static, and you noticed, I mean, hopefully today you've seen how dynamic the nature of this coastline is, and cities and governments, they try to keep the coastline static, and you can do it for a little while, but you're gonna
Oh, that's her. Okay, so I thought it was his. I'm the shortest person here now. This is not normally my position. I had to get on the knee because I felt like I was actually the shortest. Sorry.
Too, and his field assistants.
I know
we're not done
Might
yet.
be something that you don't like.
Well, I think we need to say a big thank you for a great day so far.
Thank you.
Good weather, so. All right, we've got a couple more short stops before we go to finish this off.